Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where royal protocols have been followed for centuries, a single moment changed everything. What happens when a 6-year-old prince refuses to accept the woman who married his grandfather as part of his family? The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon that no one in the royal family will ever forget. In just 3 words, Prince Louis shattered the carefully constructed image of royal harmony that the palace had worked so hard to maintain. Those words would echo through the marble halls, reach the front pages of every newspaper in Britain, and force the royal family to confront a truth they had been avoiding for years. This is not just another royal scandal. This is the story of a little boy's courage, a step-family's struggle, and the moment when the world saw that even princes are just children who miss their mothers. The incident that shocked the nation started with something as simple as a broken toy and ended with revelations that would change the royal family forever. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the blue drawing room at Windsor Castle as 6-year-old Prince Louis sat cross-legged on the Persian carpet, carefully arranging his collection of model airplanes. Each tiny aircraft was positioned with the precision that only a child completely absorbed in play could achieve. The room, usually reserved for state occasions, had become his temporary sanctuary while the adults discussed what they called important matters in the adjacent room. Louis had always been different from his older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte. Where they showed natural diplomacy even at their young ages, Louis wore his heart on his sleeve. His emotions were as clear as the summer sky outside the castle windows, and today, those emotions were turbulent. The muffled voices from the next room grew louder, though Louis couldn't make out the words. He knew they were talking about the upcoming family portrait session, another one of those events where he would be expected to stand still, smile, and pretend everything was perfect. But things weren't perfect, and Louis was old enough to know it, even if he couldn't fully understand why. His favorite airplane, a red and blue model that his mother, Princess Catherine, had given him for his birthday, suddenly slipped from his small fingers and crashed into the leg of an antique chair. One of the wings snapped off cleanly, the broken piece skittering across the polished floor. The sight of his broken toy was the final straw for a little boy who had been holding back tears for weeks. Ever since the family had started spending more time at Windsor to be closer to King Charles, everything felt different. His mother seemed tired all the time, his father, Prince William, was always in meetings, and there were new rules about when they could play and where they could go. But most confusing of all was Queen Camilla. She was always there now, at family dinners, at official events, even at what used to be private moments with Grandpa Charles. The adults kept telling him to call her Grandmama Camilla, and to treat her with the same respect he showed his beloved grandmama, Queen Elizabeth, who had passed away when he was very young, but whose memory still filled the castle with warmth and love. As Louis knelt to pick up the broken pieces of his airplane, tears began to blur his vision. The wing wouldn't fit back on properly, no matter how hard he tried to make it stick. Just like everything else in his world lately, it was broken and no one seemed able to fix it. The door to the blue drawing room opened with a soft click, and Queen Camilla entered, her heels making sharp sounds against the marble floor. She was dressed in one of her typical elegant outfits, a cream-colored suit with pearl accessories that made her look every inch the queen she had become. But to Louis, she looked like an intruder in what should have been his safe space. Camilla noticed the tears on the young prince's face immediately. Her expression softened as she approached him, her voice taking on the gentle tone she had been practicing for months in an effort to bond with her step-grandchildren. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked, kneeling down beside him on the carpet, her designer skirt pooling around her carefully. "Did you hurt yourself?" Louis looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, clutching the broken airplane to his chest. For a moment, he seemed like he might accept her comfort. Camilla had been trying so hard to find her place in this family, to be the grandmother figure these children needed while respecting the memory of their great-grandmother. "My airplane broke," Louis whispered, his voice small and shaky. Camilla smiled sympathetically and reached out to examine the toy. "Let me see if we can fix it," she said. Sometimes things that look broken can be made good as new. But as she gently tried to take the airplane from his hands, Louis pulled it back against his chest. The sudden movement caused the remaining wing to snap off completely, and the little prince's face crumpled as he watched another piece of his favorite toy break beyond repair. "Look what you did," Louis cried out, his voice rising with the kind of raw emotion that children feel so intensely. "You broke it even more." Camilla's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. She had been walking on eggshells with these children for months, trying to earn their love and acceptance, and nothing she did seemed to work. The constant pressure from the media, the criticism from royal watchers, and the weight of trying to fill an impossible role all came crashing down in that moment. "I was trying to help you," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "If you had just let me look at it properly instead of being so difficult, this wouldn't have happened." The words hung in the air between them, and Camilla immediately realized she had made a mistake. She had let her frustration show, something queens were never supposed to do, especially not with children. Louis stared at her with wide eyes, and, for a moment, the room was completely silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Then, with the devastating honesty that only children possess, Louis spoke the words that would change everything. "You're not my mother," he declared, his small voice carrying more power than any royal proclamation. "You're not my grandmama either. You're just Daddy's stepmother, and I don't have to listen to you." The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. She stood up quickly, her face pale with shock and hurt. In that moment, all her careful composure, all her years of preparation for this role, crumbled away. She wasn't just hearing the rejection of a 6-year-old child. She was hearing the voice of everyone who had ever questioned her right to be part of this family. Louis continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My real grandmama loved me. She would never have broken my toy. She would have fixed it and made it better, not worse." The door to the adjacent room burst open, and Prince William appeared, having heard his son's raised voice through the walls. Behind him came Princess Catherine, her face immediately showing concern as she took in the scene. Her youngest son in tears, holding a broken toy, and Queen Camilla standing frozen with an expression of hurt and anger. "What's happening here?" William asked, his voice carrying the authority of a future king, but also the concern of a father. Before anyone could answer, Louis ran to his mother and buried his face in her skirt, still clutching the pieces of his broken airplane. "She broke my toy," he sobbed. "She broke it, and then she was mean to me." Catherine immediately knelt down to comfort her son, her trained diplomatic mind already working to assess the situation. She could see the hurt in Camilla's eyes, the tension in her husband's posture, and the genuine distress of her child. Camilla found her voice at last, though it trembled with emotion. "I was trying to help him fix it," she said, directing her words to William and Catherine. "The toy was already broken when I came in. I was just trying to help." But Louis pulled away from his mother's embrace and looked directly at Camilla with the fearless honesty of childhood. "You yelled at me," he said. "You said I was difficult. My real grandmama would never have said that." The comparison to Queen Elizabeth, spoken so innocently by a child, cut deeper than any criticism from the press or political opposition ever could. Camilla's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, the elaborate facade of royal dignity fell away completely. William stepped forward, caught between his loyalty to his wife and stepmother and his duty to protect his son. "Louis," he said gently but firmly, "you need to apologize to Grandmama Camilla. That was not appropriate behavior for a prince." But Louis shook his head stubbornly, his jaw set with a determination that reminded everyone present of his great-grandmother's famous resolve. "She's not my grandmama," he repeated. "She's just your stepmother. I don't have to pretend she's family." The silence that followed was deafening. In those words, spoken by the youngest member of the royal family, lay a truth that everyone had been avoiding. Despite years of careful integration, despite official titles and public ceremonies, despite all the efforts to create a harmonious blended family, the emotional reality was far more complicated. Catherine gently stroked her son's hair, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words to diffuse the situation. She knew that this moment would have consequences far beyond this room. Already, she could see the pain in Camilla's eyes, the conflict in her husband's face, and the stubborn set of her son's shoulders that told her this wasn't going to be easily resolved. The broken airplane lay forgotten on the carpet, its pieces scattered like the fragments of a family trying desperately to hold itself together. Outside, the late afternoon sun continued to shine through the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding in one of Britain's most important rooms. This was just the beginning of a confrontation that would force the royal family to face truths they had been avoiding, and it all started with a 6-year-old boy who refused to pretend that everything was all right when it clearly wasn't. The emergency family meeting was called for 7 o'clock that evening in King Charles's private study at Windsor Castle. The room, lined with first edition books and family photographs spanning generations, had witnessed many important conversations throughout its history, but none quite like this one. King Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, his face showing the weariness of a man who had spent decades navigating family crises under public scrutiny. To his right, Queen Camilla occupied one of the leather chairs, her usual composure replaced by an expression of barely contained emotion. Across from them, Prince William and Princess Catherine sat side by side on the burgundy sofa, while Prince George and Princess Charlotte had been sent to the nursery with their nanny. Prince Louis, the unwitting catalyst of this gathering, sat in a smaller chair between his parents, his broken airplane now crudely repaired with tape that made it look more wounded than fixed. He had stopped crying, but his eyes remained red-rimmed, and he kept glancing nervously between the adults as if expecting another confrontation. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Charles finally spoke, his voice carrying both the authority of a king and the exhaustion of a grandfather trying to hold his family together. "We need to discuss what happened this afternoon," he began, looking directly at his youngest grandson. "Louis, I understand you were upset about your toy, but speaking to Grandmama Camilla the way you did was unacceptable." Louis's chin jutted out defiantly, a gesture that reminded everyone present of his late great-grandmother's famous stubbornness. "She made me call her Grandmama, but she's not," he said with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "Why do I have to pretend?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, exposing the fundamental issue that the family had been avoiding for months. Camilla shifted in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had known this conversation was inevitable, but hearing the rejection stated so plainly by a 6-year-old still stung. Catherine leaned forward, her diplomatic training evident as she tried to bridge the gap between her son's feelings and family obligations. "Louis, darling, sometimes in families, we have people who join us later, but they become just as important as people who were always there." But Louis shook his head with surprising firmness. "Grandmama Elizabeth was always there," he said. "She loved us before we were even born. She's the one who told me stories and gave me special biscuits and let me sit on her lap during the serious meetings." At the mention of Queen Elizabeth, Charles's expression softened with both love and grief. His mother had indeed been a constant, beloved presence in all their lives, and her absence was still keenly felt throughout the royal family. Camilla finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly with emotion. "I never expected to replace your great-grandmother, Louis," she said gently. "No one could do that. I just hope we could be friends." Louis considered this for a moment, his 6-year-old mind processing the concept of friendship versus forced family relationships. "Friends don't make you call them grandmama when they're not," he said with devastating logic. William cleared his throat, clearly struggling between his roles as a son, stepson, and father. "Louis, Queen Camilla is married to Grandpa Charles, which makes her family," he explained. "Just like how Mummy became part of our family when she married me." But Louis wasn't convinced by this adult reasoning. "Mummy chose to be our mummy," he pointed out. "She wanted to have me and George and Charlotte. But she didn't choose to be your stepmother. That just happened because of divorce. The word divorce landed in the room like a small bomb. It was a topic the royal family preferred to handle with euphemisms and careful language, but a child's perspective cut through all the diplomatic niceties to the heart of the matter. Charles winced at his grandson's stark summary of his first marriage's end, while Camilla's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and hurt. The complicated history of their relationship, with all its painful chapters, was being reduced to simple terms by a child who had no understanding of the decades of anguish that had led to this moment. "It's more complicated than that, darling," Catherine said gently, trying to help her son understand without overwhelming him with adult complexities. "Why is it complicated?" Louis asked, his voice rising with frustration. "Grandpa Charles loved Grandmama Diana first, and she was Daddy's real mother. Then she died, and then he married Camilla. But that doesn't make Camilla our grandmama. She's just the lady who married Grandpa after our real grandmama died." The mention of Diana created an almost visible tension in the room. Even years after her death, her memory remained a powerful force within the royal family, particularly for William and his children, who had grown up hearing stories about the grandmother they would never meet. Camilla stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. "I think I should go," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This conversation is clearly about me, not with me." "Camilla, please sit down," Charles said firmly, his voice carrying both authority and pleading. "We need to work through this as a family." "But I'm not family, am I?" Camilla replied, her years of insecurity finally spilling over. "That's what this is really about. No matter how many titles I have, no matter how many years I've been married to you, I'll never be truly accepted. Not by the public, not by the press, and apparently not by a 6-year-old child." Louis looked up at his grandfather with confusion. "Grandpa Charles, why is she crying? I didn't mean to make her sad. I just don't want to lie about who she is." Charles felt his heart breaking as he looked between his wife, who had tried so hard to find her place in his family, and his grandson, who was simply expressing his honest feelings without malice. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation he had feared when he decided to marry Camilla, knowing that it would create complicated dynamics that might never be fully resolved. William stood up and moved to place a supportive hand on Camilla's shoulder. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, he recognized her genuine efforts to build relationships with his children, and he could see how much Louis's rejection had hurt her. "Camilla, Louis isn't rejecting you as a person," he said diplomatically. "He's just struggling with the labels and expectations. Maybe we've been pushing too hard for everything to feel natural when it's still very new for all of us." Catherine nodded in agreement, her own experience joining the royal family helping her understand the pressure Camilla was feeling. "When I married William, it took time for people to accept me too," she said. "These relationships can't be forced. They have to develop naturally." Louis tugged on his mother's sleeve, his expression showing that he was beginning to understand the gravity of what he had caused. "Mummy, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings," he said quietly. "But I also don't want to lie about feelings I don't have yet." The honesty in his words struck everyone in the room. Here was a child expressing exactly what the adults had been dancing around for months. The difference between respecting someone and loving them, between accepting a relationship and embracing it. Camilla slowly sat back down, her eyes red but her expression thoughtful. "You know what, Louis?" she said, her voice steadier now. "You're absolutely right. I shouldn't have expected you to call me grandmama, just because the adults decided that's what would be proper." Louis looked at her with interest for the first time in the conversation. Really, Camilla confirmed. "How about this? You can call me Camilla, or Queen Camilla if we're at official events, and we can just get to know each other without any pressure. Maybe someday you'll want to call me something more family-like, and maybe you won't. Either way is okay." The relief on Louis's face was immediate and obvious. "I would like that," he said. "And I'm sorry I said you broke my airplane on purpose. I know you were trying to help." "Thank you for that apology," Camilla replied with genuine warmth. And I'm sorry I got frustrated with you. Sometimes adults forget that children need time to adjust to changes too. Charles watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and sadness. His wife was showing remarkable grace under pressure. His grandson was learning valuable lessons about honesty and kindness, but the underlying issue remained: how to build a family that honored the past while embracing the present. I think Lewis has taught us all something important today, Charles said finally. Authenticity matters more than appearances, even in our family. Perhaps we've been so focused on presenting a united front to the public that we forgot to make sure everyone actually felt united on the inside. William nodded thoughtfully. The public will follow our lead, he said. If we're comfortable with letting relationships develop naturally instead of forcing them, people will accept that. Catherine looked down at her son, who was now examining his repaired airplane with renewed interest. Lewis, what do you think? Can you be patient with all of us while we figure out how to be the best family we can be? Lewis looked around the room at all the adults who were watching him expectantly. For a moment, he felt the weight of being the youngest member of such an important family, but then he remembered his great-grandmother's advice about always telling the truth, even when it was difficult. I think we can all try to be better, he said with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of babes. But can we also just play sometimes without worrying about being perfect? Grandmama Elizabeth always said the best families are the ones that laugh together. As if on cue, a small smile appeared on Camilla's face, followed by chuckles from William and Catherine, and, finally, a deep laugh from Charles that seemed to release some of the tension that had been building for months. I think that's exactly what we needed to hear, Charles said, reaching over to ruffle his grandson's hair. Now, how about we see if the kitchen can make us some of those special biscuits Grandmama Elizabeth used to love? I think we could all use a bit of sweetness after such an honest conversation. As the family began to file out of the study, Lewis tugged on Camilla's sleeve. She looked down at him curiously. Queen Camilla, he said hesitantly. Yes, Lewis. Do you know any good stories? Not about being a queen, just regular stories. Camilla's face lit up with the first genuine smile she had worn all day. As a matter of fact, I know quite a few stories. Would you like to hear one? Lewis nodded eagerly, and as they walked toward the kitchen together, chattering about dragons and adventures, the rest of the family followed behind with hope that maybe, just maybe, they had turned a corner in their complicated journey toward becoming a real family. 6 months after the incident that had shocked the royal family into honest conversation, Windsor Castle felt different. The change wasn't visible to visitors or captured in official photographs, but anyone who spent time with the royal family could sense a new authenticity in their interactions. Prince Louis sat in the same blue drawing room where everything had started, but this time he wasn't alone with his toys. Queen Camilla sat across from him at a small table. Both of them focused intently on a jigsaw puzzle featuring vintage airplanes. The irony of the subject matter wasn't lost on the adults who occasionally passed by, but for Louis and Camilla, it had become a symbol of something that could be repaired and made beautiful again. I think this piece goes here, Louis said, holding up a section of blue sky. His relationship with Camilla had evolved slowly but genuinely over the past months. He still called her Queen Camilla in public, and simply Camilla in private, but the wariness in his eyes had been replaced by something approaching affection. Let me see, Camilla replied, adjusting her reading glasses to examine the piece. She had learned to dress more casually for these puzzle sessions, trading her formal suits for comfortable cardigans and practical shoes. Oh yes, that's perfect. You have a good eye for patterns. The compliment made Louis beam with pride. Unlike the forced praise he had received before their confrontation, this felt genuine because it was earned through time spent together rather than commanded by protocol. Princess Catherine appeared in the doorway, carrying a tea service that would have been handled by staff in the past. This, too, was part of the family's new approach to building relationships. More informal time, fewer servants hovering, and genuine moments that couldn't be scheduled or scripted. How's the puzzle coming along? She asked, setting down the tray and pouring tea for Camilla while preparing a cup of warm milk with honey for Louis. We're almost done with the sky, Lewis announced proudly. Camilla knows a lot about airplanes. Her first husband was a pilot. The casual mention of Camilla's past, something that would have been awkward territory 6 months ago, now flowed naturally in conversation. The family had learned that acknowledging their complicated histories, rather than pretending they didn't exist, actually made everyone more comfortable. Really, Catherine said with genuine interest. I didn't know that. Tell me about it, Camilla. As Camilla began sharing stories about vintage aircraft and her late first husband Andrew Parker Bowles's military service, Lewis listened with rapt attention. He was learning that the woman he had once seen as an intruder had her own rich history and interesting stories to tell. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the arrival of Prince William, who had just returned from a series of meetings in London. His tie was loosened, and he looked tired but relieved to be home. How was your day, Daddy? Lewis asked, looking up from the puzzle. Much better now, William replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs near the puzzle table. What are you two working on? It's a 1943 Spitfire, Lewis explained with the enthusiasm of a child who had recently become fascinated with World War II aircraft. Camilla says her grandfather flew one during the war. She's going to show me pictures from her family albums next week. William exchanged a meaningful look with his wife. This easy sharing of family history represented exactly the kind of genuine connection they had hoped would develop between Camilla and their children, but could never have forced into existence. That sounds wonderful, William said. I'd love to see those pictures too. We could make it a family history afternoon. Camilla looked up from the puzzle, a piece of aircraft wing still in her hand. I like that very much, she said. I have quite a few stories about the war years that I think the children would find interesting. The natural way she referred to the children rather than your children wasn't lost on anyone in the room. It had taken months of patient interaction for those small linguistic changes to occur organically. King Charles appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of comfortable conversation. At 75, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his face showed a contentment that had been missing for years. Family meeting in the drawing room, he asked with mock seriousness. Puzzle meeting, Lewis corrected him with a grin. Want to help? We need to finish the propeller. Charles settled into another chair, accepting a cup of tea from Catherine. As he examined the partially completed puzzle, he marveled at how different this scene was from the formal, tense gatherings that had characterized their family interactions for so long. Your Majesty, came a soft voice from the doorway. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development with the press situation we discussed. Private Secretary James Morrison looked uncomfortable about interrupting what was clearly a private family moment, but the expression on his face suggested the matter was urgent. Charles sighed, the weight of kingship never completely absent even in these personal moments. What now? The Daily Mail has gotten wind of the incident from 6 months ago. Morrison explained carefully. They're planning to run a story about Prince Louis's conversation with Queen Camilla. Their headline is quite sensational. The adults in the room immediately tensed, while Lewis continued working on the puzzle, not fully understanding the implications of media attention on their private family matters. What exactly do they know? William asked, his voice taking on the edge it always carried when dealing with press intrusion into his children's lives. Morrison glanced at Lewis before continuing. They have the basic facts about a disagreement, but they're characterizing it as evidence of family discord and questioning Queen Camilla's relationship with the grandchildren. Camilla's face went pale, and she unconsciously moved away from the puzzle table, as if creating physical distance could somehow protect Lewis from being dragged into a media storm. No, Lewis said firmly, surprising everyone by looking up from the puzzle with a determined expression. They can't say mean things about Camilla. The adults stared at him in surprise. Catherine knelt down beside her son's chair. What do you mean, sweetheart? If they write mean things about Camilla, people will think she's mean to me, but she's not, Lewis explained with the clarity that had become his trademark. She helps me with puzzles and tells me stories and never makes me pretend to feel things I don't feel. That's being nice, not mean. William felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to his son defend the woman he had once rejected so publicly. Would you like to tell people that yourself, Louis? Louis considered this seriously. Can I tell them the truth? All of it. Charles exchanged glances with Camilla, who nodded slowly. What truth would you want to tell them? That I was sad and angry when my toy broke, and I said things that hurt Camilla's feelings, Louis said thoughtfully, and that she was trying to help me, but I was too upset to let her, and that now we're friends because we talked about our feelings instead of pretending they weren't there. Catherine smiled at her son's mature summary of their family's journey. That's a very grown-up way to explain it. Great-grandmama Elizabeth always said that telling the truth, even when it's complicated, is better than letting people make up their own stories, Louis said. And people always make up worse stories than the truth. Camilla wiped away a tear that had formed in the corner of her eye. You know what, Louis? You're absolutely right. And I think your great-grandmother would be very proud of how you've handled this situation. So we tell them the truth? Charles asked, looking around the room for consensus. We tell them our truth, William corrected. The story of a family learning to be honest with each other and growing closer because of it. Morrison looked skeptical about the public relations wisdom of such transparency, but Charles raised a hand to forestall his concerns. James arranged for a family interview, something comfortable and informal, and make sure they understand that Prince Louis will only participate if he wants to, and only for as long as he's comfortable. Louis returned to the puzzle, fitting the propeller piece into place with satisfaction. Can we finish this first? He asked. I want to see the whole airplane. As the family returned their attention to the puzzle, working together to complete the vintage Spitfire, Morrison quietly excused himself to begin arranging what would become one of the most honest and humanizing interviews the royal family had ever given. 3 weeks later, the interview aired during prime time on BBC One. Instead of the stiff, formal setting usually chosen for royal interviews, the family gathered in the same blue drawing room where their journey toward authenticity had begun. The completed airplane puzzle sat prominently on the table, along with several photo albums and a fresh tea service. When the interviewer asked Louis about his relationship with Queen Camilla, his answer was simple and honest. She's not my grandmama like great-grandmama Elizabeth was, but she doesn't need to be. She's Camilla, and she's really good at puzzles and knows interesting stories. Sometimes the best families are the ones where people can just be themselves. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Instead of a scandal about family discord, the story became one of a modern blended family navigating complex relationships with honesty and patience. Social media praised the royal family's authenticity, and child psychologists commended their approach to allowing relationships to develop naturally rather than forcing them. Most importantly for the family themselves, the interview marked the end of pretending that their relationships were simpler than they actually were. Louis continued to call Camilla by her first name in private, and Queen Camilla in public. He never called her grandmama, but their friendship deepened into something that was uniquely theirs. On quiet afternoons, visitors to Windsor Castle might find them in the blue drawing room, working on increasingly complex jigsaw puzzles while sharing stories and comfortable silences. The broken airplane from that first confrontation had been properly repaired and now sat on Louis's shelf at home, a reminder that some things, when broken, can be fixed to be even stronger than before. The royal family had learned that authenticity, even when messy and complicated, created stronger bonds than any amount of protocol or pretense. And it had all started with a 6-year-old boy who had the courage to say what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to admit. That love cannot be commanded, but respect and friendship can be earned, one honest conversation at a time. Years later, when royal historians looked back on this period, they would mark it as a turning point in how the royal family presented itself to the world. But for Louis and Camilla, it was simply the beginning of a friendship built on truth, patience, and the understanding that the best relationships are those where both people are free to be exactly who they are.